It was the year 1000 AD, some 500 years before the historic voyages of Christopher Columbus. A Viking crew prepared to leave Greenland and head for unknown lands. Sailors who'd been blown off course had earlier sighted land further west in the North Atlantic seas. Tales of these sightings had circulated around Greenland for 15 years. Finally, men bold enough and curious enough would find out what really lay in the great beyond. They set sail through uncharted waters, with no maps, no compass, and relying on little more than the currents, the stars, and the sun to guide them. From generation to generation, the Vikings recounted tales of voyages to a place they called Vinland. As they huddled around the fire for warmth, for entertainment, tales were spun as the burning embers crackled. Hundreds of years later, the tales were finally written down in what became known as the Icelandic sagas. Scholars have long since debated whether the sagas are history or literature, or perhaps something in between.
They went ashore and looked about them. The weather was fine. There was dew on the grass, and the first thing they did was to get some of it on their hands and put it to their lips. And to them, it seemed the sweetest thing they'd ever tasted, the Greenlander saga.
Today there's proof that it was these Viking explorers and not Christopher Columbus who were the first Europeans to reach North American shores. But knowledge of this period is incomplete, filled with speculation and controversy. And although the sagas tell us that the Vikings came to a place they called Vinland, questions persist. Where exactly is Vinland? What did the Vikings encounter during their brief stay? And how much of North America did they really see? This is the true mystery of the Vikings in North America. In 1960, two Norwegian explorers uncovered the footsteps of their ancient predecessors. Here in Canada, a North American Viking settlement was discovered, unearthed, and reconstructed in the town of Lawns Meadows in Newfoundland. The area may be some or even all of Vinland. In either case, the settlement represents the westernmost reach of a land-hungry and adventurous people. The remains opened a window into a hidden but not forgotten past.
Before the archaeological digs at Lawns Meadow, before the empirical evidence that provides, people did believe it. And the reason they believed it was the sagas tell the story so rationally, so plainly.
They put to sea as soon as they were ready and sailed for 3 days until land was lost to sight below the horizon. Then the fair wind failed and northerly winds and fog set in. And for many days, they had no idea what their course was. After that, they saw the sun again and were able to get their bearing. They hoisted sail, and after a day's journey, they sighted land, the Greenlander saga.
Lawns Meadows is a place that was easy to reach by sea. It was a good, secure base for people who were great seamen and great sailors. It was a place you could go back to. You could repair boats there. You could fix things up. You could rest and refit, and then you could do more voyages further south.
The foundation for the Viking migration from Norway to North America began hundreds of years before their landing parties stepped ashore on Vinland. From around 750 AD to the year 1050, they impacted history in a colorful era known as the Viking Age. The core of their world was a loosely defined group of Scandinavian lands comprising more or less what we know today as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Vikings, later known also as the Norse, have long figured strongly in our imaginations. Their vivid history is steeped in mythology, exploration, and conquest.
At the start of the Viking Age, Norway was divided into a series of petty kingdoms, often at war with each other. One often looks at the Vikings in relation to what they did to the other peoples of Europe. but among themselves they fought rather constantly. Vikings often were the farmer who was the richest man, who was the man who could afford a ship, and then he would crew it with the people in the surrounding areas.
Vikings as farmers? The notion flew in the face of European perceptions, as the Norse were only seen as warriors. Vikings certainly had a well-developed love of battle and conquest, but for most of the year they worked the land. Their adventures were mostly confined to summer, when sailing conditions were at their best.
The Norse in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have been experimenting with ever more seaworthy vessels and with ever more effective navigation techniques that allow them to just cut right across and go out of sight of land and make long sea voyages.
The ships gave the Vikings a fearsome reputation throughout Europe. Ideal for raiding, they could appear suddenly, strike without warning, and withdraw before the local people could retaliate. Due to these brief, hostile encounters, the Europeans south of Scandinavia knew little about the northern raiders. Consequently, many misconceptions arose, such as the depiction of Vikings wearing horned helmets. This is pure myth, although it may have arisen from the Vikings' own mythology. This particular artifact is not of a Viking warrior, but is believed to represent a pagan legend tied to Viking culture.
The Vikings were pagans and the Europeans were Christian. And that didn't help the European attitude to the Vikings. The Christians were not allowed to trade with pagans.
This isolation from other Europeans made it easier for Vikings to justify their barbaric ways. During raids, raping, pillaging, and slave-taking were commonplace in the Vikings' battle tactics.
In the 9th and 10th centuries, wanderlust, adventure is clearly a part of the Viking movement west. It was something for young people to do, especially young men once they reached 15. The desire to go on a Viking journey, raid, was a part of the rite of passage.
The readiness to do battle was tied into the Viking pagan religion. Death on the battlefield was certain glory, and the only path to eternity in Valhalla, Norse conception of heaven. Vikings looked forward to a glorious afterlife, one infinitely more pleasurable than their earthly world.
Pagans saw the natural world as populated with all kinds of creatures, trolls, elves, orcs, and demons. The sorts of things that Tolkien wrote about in Lord of the Rings were very real to the people at this time period.
Eventually, the Vikings' plunder of Germany, France, England, Scotland, and Ireland evolved into conquests and settlement. The Viking lifestyle and the way they thought produced individuals willing to chance their luck in new territories. This was especially true for those Vikings who returned after being less than victorious in battle.
And so the question is, what happens to the losers? I think if you're on the wrong side, the losing side, you'll have trouble coming back, establishing yourself in Norway. Maybe you simply have to go abroad.
Some moved on to small islands to the west, as well as parts of Scotland and England, and to Ireland, where the Vikings founded the city of Dublin in 841 AD. Besides the Viking wanderlust, there was another, more political reason for them to move westward.
King Harald Fairhair was consolidating Norway into one kingdom. This put a lot of pressure on individual chieftains who could not hang on to their own power. So they chose to immigrate to a place like Iceland, which was more or less uninhabited.
In the year 860 AD, Iceland was settled by political refugees from Norway, as well as by those Vikings who were simply looking for new opportunities. Over time, Iceland proved to be a major stepping stone in the Viking path towards the shores of North America. But the journey was thousands of miles through uncharted seas. Who would be willing to sacrifice home and hearth for a voyage into the unknown? When we return, we'll find out how Eric the Red discovered Greenland and inspired his son, Leif Erikson, to become an explorer. Around the time that the Vikings were sailing west in the North Atlantic, a number of significant developments were taking place elsewhere. The Vikings certainly weren't the only ones spilling blood on the battlefield. In Japan, by the year 1000 AD, the samurai had established themselves as a potent and feared warrior class. While the Vikings were raiding various countries in Europe, in Central America, the Toltec warriors were invading several Mayan centers, including the fabled city of Chichen Itza. In 990 AD, North America's first city, Cahokia, was built near the site that would eventually be the city of St. Louis, Missouri. At its height, Cahokia was home to 40,000 Native Americans. By the year 980 AD, the Vikings were already well entrenched in their westward expansion, one that would ultimately carry them from Norway to North America. Iceland not only attracted refugees from political change in Norway, but also those whom the local assemblies had branded as outlaws.
To be deemed an outlaw simply meant that you could be killed on sight. And you could be an outlaw for life, or you could be an outlaw for a restricted period of time.
In either case, to remain in Norway as an outlaw meant certain death. It was under these conditions that a young man of no great distinction at the time began his journey toward immortality. His name was Eric the Red.
Eric the Red was born in Norway, but came to Iceland as a very young man with his father because his father had got in trouble in Norway with some killings.
Although Eric's father was an outlaw in Norway, the family was entitled to a fresh start in Iceland. There, the settlers were trying to put the combative ways of the Vikings behind them.
The society that was created in Iceland is unable to withstand warfare. And these farmers were very careful not to let feuds turn into warfare, so the matters were adjudicated at the local assemblies, the local courts.
When Eric the Red killed some of his new neighbors during a feud, he forfeited his privilege to live in Iceland. Like his father before him, he then faced exile as an outlaw. Unable to turn back to Norway, the Icelandic sagas say Eric sailed off in search of a new home.
They knew about lands further. There had been reports and sightings, but what Eric did is he went out and explored it. And what he found was a land which was really on the edge of the habitable world.
Eric set off to colonize the country he had discovered. He named it Greenland, for he said that people would be much more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. Eric's Saga.
Eric returned briefly to Iceland, where he attracted 25 boatloads of land-hungry settlers, all eager to join him in establishing a new homeland in Greenland. In 985 AD, in the village of Brattahlid, Eric the Red, a former outlaw, was now a respected chieftain. He had taken the Vikings to the next stepping stone in their westward expansion. And yet, what lay beyond Greenland? Was this the limit of the world? For most Europeans at the time, it was, but not to the Vikings.
From the Viking standpoint, they thought that they were sailing around this great, huge ocean that had a ring of land all around it. And inevitably, from their standpoint, as you went further west, you found more islands. Some were big, some were small. So when they went from Iceland and found Greenland, it wasn't a big surprise.
According to the sagas, what prompted the next leg of the Vikings' journey west was the sighting of land beyond Greenland by a merchant whose ship had been blown off course. For years, stories circulated about 3 distinct bodies of land to the west. But the Greenland settlers were far too busy establishing homes and farmsteads to attempt further exploration. Finally, after 15 years, the time came to venture out.
The only person who really could do anything about it was the paramount chieftain, Eric Ferred. Only he would have authority and assets to gather an expedition large enough to go out and search for these new areas.
Eric knew his exploring days were over. However, the man who would carry on the family tradition was none other than Leif Erikson, the oldest of Eric the Red's 4 children. Leif was a new kind of Viking. He was destined to take over from Eric, not as a hot-tempered chieftain, but as a cool-headed community leader. Leif was the ideal man to take his people on an expedition toward a new and unknown land, one they would call Vinland, and history would call North America. According to the sagas, the voyage from Greenland was not one of months or even weeks, but one of only a few days. Still, it was no pleasure cruise. The journey in the open boats meant the 35 sailors were constantly exposed to the elements, never dry, and ever hungry for a hot meal. But these were small sacrifices to be made for the potential benefits that lay ahead.
What they were looking for was a pasture. They were looking for a place where they could make a fresh settlement, and only there could they have a hope of fulfilling the dream that Leif was following, the dream of following his own father's footsteps, of having a successful land taking, a successful place where a settlement could be founded, where animals could be brought in, and where a European lifestyle could take root.
The Vikings were also looking for trees, sorely missing from Greenland, but essential for the building of ships. When Leif Erikson's expedition of Greenlanders finally reached the place he named Vinland, they apparently found the area quite favorable. Vinland had plentiful natural resources, including excellent opportunities for whaling, fishing, and hunting. After Leif Erikson discovered Vinland, the sagas tell of 4 subsequent voyages from Greenland in an attempt to maintain a settlement in North America.
We have the saga accounts, but as we suspect, they're probably boiled down, they're probably reduced, simplified, and cleaned up of the messy reality that really happened.
1,000 years after the fact, we can only speculate what the Vikings thought about their Vinland experiences.
These people didn't think they were going into an empty, friendly wilderness. It wasn't a nice Boy Scout jaunt. This was going into an area that was potentially evil, that was potentially steeped with evil spirits, with hostile land spirits, hostile sea spirits. A place where if you got too far away from your comrades, something might get you, or you might return having had an experience that would change you forever.
It was in this context in which the Vikings encountered the Native Americans, whom they called Skraelings. The word translates to mean wretched ones.
They weren't ever sure when they met somebody on a distant shore whether that was a real human being or whether it was some creature that was pretending to be human. And that's why we have accounts like in the sagas, the first thing they try when they meet a group of Native Americans sleeping under boats is to come up with swords and axes and see if you can kill them, to see if they bleed like humans do, and then you know what you're dealing with.
This, of course, set the stage for the hostilities that followed. The sagas tell of brief episodes of trade and coexistence, but they also recount how Leif's brother Torvald and others were killed during several battles with the so-called Skraelings. But how much faith should we place in the sagas? In a moment, we'll trace the origins of these ancient stories and learn how scholars have struggled to unlock their secrets. As paper, parchment, and papyrus were unknown in the Viking world, there was no written literature. The history of these Viking voyages of exploration were made up of myth and legend. Tales of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, and other Vikings were recounted orally in what became known as the Icelandic sagas. These were an entertaining but confusing blend of fact and fiction.
A lot of scholars have, of course, read the sagas, and there's been a lot of discussions as to the whereabouts of Vinland and whether the sagas were for real or whether they were just fairy tales.
The sagas were not written down until several centuries after they had first been told.
The stories in the 13th century become a part of the written tradition, but until then, the stories and the laws, basic fundamental laws of the society, are passed on through the oral tradition. They're extremely important for the preservation of the culture from generation to generation.
Most of the sagas are stories that was told at the contemporary time, but wasn't written down until a couple of hundred years later. And that also introduces some possibilities for flaws. Evidently, the people writing down the sagas wanted to legitimize their past. So they're sort of juggling a little bit with history to make it look nice from their point of view.
With the Vinland sagas, we have several versions of the same event, so to speak. And in one, Leif Erikson is the hero. And in the other one, it's an Icelander by the name of Thorfinn Karlsefni. And that particular version of the sagas was written down by a descendant of Thorfinn Karlsefni. By making his ancestor the important person, perhaps he had in mind that through that he could lay claim to the areas discovered at that time.
Karlsefni and his men sailed into the estuary and named the place Hope. Here they found wild wheat growing in fields on all the low ground and grapevines on all the higher ground. Eric Saga.
For 500 years, school children in most of the world have been taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America, not the Vikings. The Vikings' earlier voyages were largely unknown outside of Scandinavia. All that changed in the year 1837, when the sagas were translated and published in the United States by Scandinavian immigrants eager to promote awareness of their Norse heritage.
As editions came out in English and in German and other major European languages, people began to realize that there was this record of the Vinland voyages in Eric the Red saga and the Greenlander saga, and that sparked, of course, this tremendous interest. So for generations afterwards, people tried to use the sagas as these very precise guidebooks to where Vinland was. And any number of Scandinavian, German, and English-speaking expeditions set out to try to find Vinland.
One of the clues the sagas offered was that Vinland was a place where wild grapes grew. This aspect of the tale has long been a source of speculation, controversy, and confusion. As a result, a number of theories have been offered.
The grapes are one of the mysteries. The sagas very clearly state that there were grapes. One of the things that's so terribly interesting is that we look at the type of stories that the Norse people are telling about their discoveries. They're not talking about fabulous cities of gold and all kinds of crazy people. They're talking about grapes and wild wheat, which is a farmer's dream.
The term Vinland or Vinland is a matter of some scholarly debate. The name Vinland first appears in Adam of Bremen's account, where a reference is made to grapes.
Adam of Bremen was an 11th century monk and historian. As he had contact with the Scandinavian people, it is believed he probably heard stories of Vinland.
He says that the land is called Vinland because of these grapes, being wineland or vineland. Adam of Bremen, writing in 1076, is a German. He knows what wine is. If he hears the term vin or vin, it's perhaps natural that he thinks of vines. We don't know if, in fact, he was told there were grapes there.
Scholars agree that when the Vinland sagas were finally written down, centuries after they had first been told, the Icelandic scribes applied creative license. Could they have used Adam of Bremen's work for reference and embellished the story based on his mention of grapes? Is it coincidence that the man in the sagas who finds the grapes is German, as Bremen was?
But there is also the speculation, and this is related to the linguistic discussion, that vin in Vinland does not mean grape, but it means meadow. V-I-N, the Old Norse word vin with a short vowel, is meadowland. So it's Vinland as opposed to Vinland.
Yet another theory suggests that Leif Erikson is responsible for our confusion. After all, his father, Eric, gave the vast frozen tundra that he discovered the appealing but misleading name of Greenland. Did Leif, following in his father's footsteps, give the land he found a good name? A name like Vinland would certainly have attracted settlers. Did he really find grapes somewhere in Vinland, or somewhere in his imagination? We may never know, but the riddle has fueled a great deal of interest in Viking history. In 1880, the first important archaeological discovery was made. An almost complete Viking ship was found buried in the town of Gokstad, Norway. The find was exciting news, especially to Norwegians, as it shed new light on the mystery.
Because it appeals to the popular imagination to such a great extent that Norwegians had grown up sort of knowing the story of the Vikings and their venture west. It was something that they all internalized and believed. And now they had a ship that demonstrated that this was possible.
Norwegians quickly built a replica of the Gokstad ship to test its sailing qualities. This was the first of many reproductions that continued to be made to the present day.
When they started to sail those replicas and found how wonderfully well they moved in the sea and how good ships they really were, that people started to believe that it is actually possible to cross the Atlantic in one of these things.
The archaeology of the next 80 years was often disappointing. A number of Norse finds in America, such as the Kensington Stone, ultimately proved to be hoaxes or mistakes. The hunt was on for hard evidence to confirm that the Vikings actually made the journey to North America. But should the search be isolated to areas where wild grapes were growing? Next, we'll learn how the sagas and an ancient map helped a man and a woman in their search for the elusive Vinland.
They were so impatient to land that they could not bear to wait for the rising tide to float the ship. They ran ashore to a place where a river flowed out of a lake, the Greenlander Saga.
The ancient tale of Vikings crossing the ocean to North American shores was brought vividly into the 20th century by Helga and Anna-Stina Ingstad. In their mountain retreat in Lillehammer, Norway, the quiet life they live today is in sharp contrast to their former lives. Back in 1960, when Helga was 60 years old, a time when most men begin to slow down, he and his wife were determined to find Vinland, the fabled North American territory that Vikings had attempted to colonize 1,000 years earlier. But how did the Ingstads know where to look? To solve an ancient mystery, Helga used a 400-year-old Icelandic map.
The Skálholt map played an important role. It's a map which gives a broad strokes the outline of Hetlaland, Markland, and an area which is called Vinland. It's represented as a promontory on the map. It's very vague, but nevertheless, it provides a view that the Norse people had of what was out further to the west. And following this map, it helped in finding the settlement.
Besides the map, the Ingstads also used descriptions given in the Icelandic sagas.
There was no grass to be seen, and the hinterland was covered with great glaciers. And between glaciers and shore, the land was like one great slab of rock. Leif said, "I shall give this country a name and call it Heljuland," the Greenlander saga.
In the sagas, a passage tells how the Vikings sighted land that was thick with forests. Leif Erikson named this area Markland, which roughly translates to tree land. Looking at a map of the northwestern Atlantic, Helge Ingstad assumed that if Heljuland and Markland matched up to Baffin Island and Labrador, then Vinland, or at least some part of Vinland, might be Newfoundland. But there was just one problem. The island has nearly 11,000 miles of coastline.
I hired planes and I hired boats and traveled all along the rugged coast of Newfoundland, examining and asking questions, and people, all fishermen, thought I was a little crazy asking about the settlement that was 1,000 years old. But I kept on. And after many disappointments, late in the fall, I came to the very northern part of Newfoundland, the very tip.
There, in a sleepy little fishing village named Lonzo Meadows, Helge Ingstad met a crusty old fisherman.
I asked him the old question, have you seen any old ruins here? And here, he was a very intelligent man. And he said, yes, I have. Follow me, he said.
George Decker took Helga and Anastina to a site where there were a number of odd mounds. Because they predated the time when the locals had settled there, the people had always assumed they were of Native American origin. The Ingstads were hoping their excavations would prove differently.
My wife was the archaeological leader. So that was a very exciting excavation in the beginning. We didn't know what it was.
In the beginning, I had no proof at all of anything. So it could be Eskimos, it could be newer settlers, it could be Indians, and it could be Norse people. So, after a while, I found charcoal, and I collected charcoal for carbon dating.
Subsequent carbon-14 dating indicated this site was established around the year 1000 AD, the time the Vikings would have made their Atlantic crossing. But proof of Norse origin came from specific artifacts and building materials.
I found stone settings, so it was a fireplace, which was very similar to a fireplace found in Eirik the Red's house in Greenland. And so, and as far as I knew, no Indians or Eskimos had similar fireplaces. And I found the turf walls, which also were in use in Iceland and in Greenland.
Although there is more speculation than proof, Parks Canada archaeologist Birgitta Wallace agrees with the Ingstad's theory that the main occupant of the 8 sod structures was none other than Leif Erikson.
A good reason for thinking that Leif was really here is that this is a very substantial settlement and very large. About 85 people would have been here, and that represented a very high proportion of a Greenland workforce at the time. We can also see that it was a person of some authority who lived in some of these buildings, and this being the very largest and most complex one on the site is probably where the most important person on the site resided, and that would have been Leif Erikson on the very first expeditions, and this was probably built on the first very organized expedition.
Little by little, I got more proofs that it could be Norse. And after some years, we found a spinning wheel of soapstone. That was exactly the same as spindle wheels found in Norway. That was a proof that the women had been there. And that was also mentioned in the sagas.
As Anastina's excavations continued to unearth evidence, more proof came from iron artifacts.
We found iron nails in the houses where the doorways, so they had probably been in the doors. We also found a smithy, and that told me that the people was iron using people, so it couldn't be Eskimos nor Indians.
As far as we know at this point, this is the first time iron was ever made in North America, because the Aboriginal people didn't smelt metals. They used metals, but they cold hammered them. And what was found on the site was slag, which is the residue from making iron.
The most exciting proof came at the end of the Ingstad's excavations, when they found this iron cloak pin. To the layman, it might seem rather ordinary, but to the trained eye, it was a clearly identifiable Norse artifact, the final proof that the Lonzo Meadows site was a genuine Viking settlement. But did this mean that Newfoundland was Vinland? The Vinland described in the sagas was supposed to be a land where wild grapes were found. But there are no grapes of any kind in Newfoundland, so how could it be Vinland? A noted archaeologist offers a clue that may reveal where the Vikings found the grapes.
Leif said to his men, "Now we have two tasks on our hands. On alternate days we must gather grapes and cut vines, and then fell trees to make a cargo for my ship." The Greenlander Saga.
How could the Norse settlement Helga and Anastina Ingstad found in Lonzo Meadows, Newfoundland, be the Vinland where Leif Erikson established his settlement? The sagas tell us grapes were discovered in Vinland, and yet there are no grapes in Newfoundland. To Helga Ingstad, who discovered the Norse settlement in Lonzo Meadows, the grapes are pure myth.
Of course, there will still always be some amateurs that believe that you have to go far south to find the grapes and all that stuff, which we don't believe at all. But there is no use trying to convince these people.
But archaeologist Birgitta Wallace believes the grapes are an important clue. She joined the Ingstad's excavations in 1965 and continued on at Lonzo Meadows after they left in 1968. Among the evidence Wallace uncovered were 3 butternuts. At first glance, this was an unremarkable find, but to her, it may be of great significance.
They had never, ever grown in Newfoundland, not even when it was warmer. They have never grown north of New Brunswick in the St. Lawrence Valley.
Wallace is convinced the Vikings must have traveled south to get those butternuts, using the Lonzo Meadows site as a base camp for further exploration.
It's really interesting because where the butternuts grow, you also have wild growing grapes. So this is almost proof of the sagas when they talk so much about grapes that give name to the land that was so wonderful to them, Vinland, land of wine.
The argument, of course, is perhaps one that will never be answered. It's a mystery that may never be solved. But if the one base that the Vikings had in the Vinland settlement was in northern Newfoundland at Lonzo Meadows, there is no reason that they could not have sailed into the St. Lawrence or down along the coast of what would later become North America. They may have found grapes subsequently.
The extent of the Vikings' travels in North America is virtually unknown. However, there are tantalizing clues. A Norse coin found in an ancient Indian compound in Maine suggests possible travel further south. Archaeologists believe this Eskimo artifact found in the Canadian Arctic is probably an Eskimo depiction of a Norseman. Where did the two peoples meet? The archaeological evidence uncovered at the site of the Viking settlement in Lonzo Meadows offers no hint as to why the Norse left North America. Only the sagas offer an explanation. The fourth voyage to Vinland by an Icelander named Thorfinn Karlsefni appears to have been the most ambitious and final attempt by the Vikings to settle Vinland.
Karlsefni and his men had realized by now that although the land was excellent, they could never live there in safety or freedom from fear because of the native inhabitants. So they made ready to leave the place and return home. Eric's saga.
One of the contributing factors that the Norse stay in North America became short was certainly the presence of large populations already there. The Norse knew they were outnumbered.
Maybe the first encounters weren't all that hostile, but simply that there were too many cultural differences for them to get along.
Archaeologists speculate the Vinland settlement held out for 15 years at most. Disheartened, the settlers returned to Greenland, which in itself only continued as a Norse outpost till the 1400s. Then the people there simply vanished. One theory has them succumbing to bubonic plague, the Black Death of the Middle Ages.
We don't know what happened to the Greenland settlement. And that, of course, is one of the greatest of the mysteries. One possibility is that English slavers may have come up and taken the very last remains of the European settlers and sold them somewhere in Africa. Another possibility is that the settlers simply blended into the more successful Inuit Eskimo culture and disappeared.
The Greenlanders certainly had difficulty with their environment. They coped with eroding pastures and a lack of forests. This need for wood seems to explain why they continued to come to North America as late as the year 1350. Icelandic annals of that time document voyages to Markland, which most scholars today agree is Labrador. In the broad sweep of history, the Vikings' migration across the Atlantic was ephemeral, an impossible dream. Why then was it possible for Christopher Columbus to succeed?
The Vinland voyages were made not by a royal-sponsored project with lots of backing, with reinforcements possible, with additional funding out there. It was instead, as we've seen, a series of individual family enterprises. We're also talking about a very different scale. The smallest of Columbus's ships had something like 10 times the cargo capacity of Leif Erikson's vessels. So we're talking about a very different capacity to put people on the beach and to keep them there just from the first day.
The Native Americans were able to repel the Vikings, but they never stood a chance against Columbus. His men brought guns and European diseases that decimated those who tried to stop the flow of European settlers. The Vikings had no such advantages, and although we have an idea why the Vinland settlement was unsuccessful, our knowledge is incomplete.
There's an awful lot we don't know about the Norse voyages to North America. We probably don't know how many there were. We probably don't know where they went. And of course, that is always that question is there another Lonzo Meadows out there? Or a half a dozen of them?
There are many places yet to be explored, many places eroded by the sea and lost to time. So much we still don't know and may never discover about the first contact between the old world and the new, and the mysteries of the Vikings in North America.